Imagine you are holding a book, not a paperback, not something you picked up at an airport. This is the largest book ever written, 300,000 pages, each one representing a single year of human existence on this planet. You hold all of human history in your hands. Now flip to the final page, the last one, the very last leaf of parchment. That page, that single page, is everything you learned in school. Every pharaoh, every emperor, every war, every revolution, the pyramids of Giza, the fall of Rome, the Black Death, Columbus, Shakespeare, the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the moon landing, all of it, every single thing you were ever taught about human history fits on that one final page. The other 299,999 pages, blank. Not because nothing happened, but because we forgot. Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to feel the weight of what I just said. 300,000 years. 300,000 years of people who looked exactly like you. People who laughed at things that surprised them. People who held their children close in the dark. People who buried their dead and stood at the graveside wondering, just like you wonder, whether something continues after the last breath. 300,000 years of love and hunger, fear and wonder, music and war and silence under stars so bright they seem impossible to us now. And we remember almost none of it. Here is a number that should stop you cold. Civilization, cities, writing, agriculture, governments, all the things we call advanced, is approximately 12,000 years old. That is it. 12,000 years. Out of 300,000. Do the math. Civilization represents 4% of human existence. 4%. The other 96%. That is the story this film is about. Now try to hold that number inside you in a way that is actually meaningful, not just intellectual. Our brains are terrible at comprehending deep time. We hear 300,000 years, and it feels abstract, distant, almost fictional. So let me give you a frame you can feel. Compress all of human history into a single 24-hour day. Midnight to midnight, the full span of our species. Anatomically, modern humans appear at the very first stroke of midnight. They begin moving through Africa in darkness. They develop language, art, spirituality, complex tools, all of it happening in the deep hours before dawn, before the rest of the world wakes up. Cave paintings. Those happen around 9 in the morning. The Great Migration out of Africa, the journey that would eventually carry our ancestors to every corner of the globe, that begins around 8:30 a.m. The first settled villages, late afternoon, around 4:30 p.m. The pyramids, they get built at 11:49 p.m. Jesus Christ is born at 11:54 p.m. The entire history of the United States, every president, every war, every invention, every cultural moment from the Pilgrims to right now, fits inside the last 3 seconds before midnight. 3 seconds. You are 3 seconds old as a civilization. You are 300,000 years old as a species. And for the first 23 hours and 49 minutes of your existence, you lived in a way that has been almost completely erased from your memory. That is what we are going to recover tonight. This is not a story about ancient people who were primitive and struggling and waiting to be civilized. This is the story of who we actually are, the full version, not the censored one. The uncut history of Homo sapiens before the editorial decisions of civilization stripped most of it away. By the time you finish watching this, you will understand why you fear the dark. You will understand why you crave stories around fires. You will understand why you feel a deep, inarticulate longing for community that modern life never quite satisfies. No matter how many followers you have, no matter how many notifications light up your phone, you will understand, perhaps for the first time, what you actually are. Not what history class told you you are. What you actually are. Let's begin. But there is another way to hold this truth that does not require a metaphor at all. Just hold the number itself. 300,000 years. Attempt for a moment to actually feel the scale of that figure, rather than simply noting it intellectually. Your great-great-grandmother was born perhaps in the 1870s. She is 4 generations back. Go back 100 generations to the year 500 CE, approximately, when Rome had already fallen and Constantinople was the center of the Western world. Your ancestor at 100 generations back was as fully human as you are. She worried about her children. She felt the cold. She told stories. Go back 500 generations. You are now in approximately 10,000 BCE, at the very dawn of the Neolithic period, the moment agriculture is just beginning to appear in the Fertile Crescent. Your ancestor at 500 generations is still a fully modern human, almost certainly living as a hunter-gatherer, possessing a brain and a nervous system, and an emotional life identical to yours. Go back 15,000 generations. You are at 300,000 years before present. You are at the beginning, the anatomically modern beginning, of the human story. Your ancestor of 15,000 generations ago looked at the stars and wondered what they were, felt love and fear and the strange vertigo of consciousness, tried to make sense of a world that did not come with instructions. 15,000 generations. That is not a vast, incomprehensible abstraction. That is a chain of individual human lives, each one real, each one complete in itself, stretching back to the first people who looked like you. And for 14,880 of those generations, roughly, no one planted a crop. No one built a city. No one wrote a word. That is the world we have forgotten. That is the story we have never properly been told. Let us tell it now. There is a skull sitting in a locked case in a museum in Rabat, Morocco. It has been there for decades, reassembled from fragments with extraordinary patience, pieced together the way you might piece together a ceramic bowl that shattered on a stone floor. Most museum visitors walk right past it. It does not have the drama of a T-Rex or the golden glamour of Tutankhamun. It is just bone, old bone, reconstructed bone, a face that has been dead for so long the concept of death no longer quite applies. But look at it. Really look. The cheekbones, the jaw, the orbital structure around the eyes. You know that face. You have seen that face before. You have seen it in the mirror. That skull is from Jebel Irhoud, a limestone cave in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains. And according to the most rigorous dating methods available to modern science, thermoluminescence dating of burned flints found alongside the bones, it is approximately 315,000 years old. 315,000 years old. And it looks like someone you might pass on the street in Chicago or Phoenix or Minneapolis today. This single fact should rearrange something fundamental in the way you think about human history. For most of the 20th century, the story of human origins was elegantly simple. Scientists believed that Homo sapiens, our species, emerged in East Africa around 200,000 years ago. The Great Rift Valley, probably somewhere in Ethiopia or Kenya. A small, geographically contained population. The Garden of Eden, but a scientific one. Jebel Irhoud destroyed that story. Here was Morocco, literally on the opposite side of the African continent from the proposed cradle of humanity, producing fossils that were not only older than anything from East Africa, but showed essentially modern facial anatomy. The Jebel Irhoud people were not proto-humans on the way to becoming us. They already were us, or at minimum, they were our first cousins, separated by a few 100,000 years of continental geography. What did this discovery actually mean? It meant the emergence of our species was far more complex, far more distributed, far more interesting than anyone had imagined. Homo sapiens did not emerge in a single location. We emerged from a network. Picture Africa 315,000 years ago. The continent looked dramatically different from today. Global temperatures were different. Sea levels were different. And crucially, the Sahara was not the impassable barrier it would later become. During wetter periods, green corridors threaded through what is now endless sand, connecting the Atlantic coast to the Nile Valley, connecting North Africa to the Horn of Africa. The continent was a living, breathing, shifting mosaic of ecosystems. In this environment, scattered populations of proto-humans and early Homo sapiens were not isolated islands. They were nodes in a continental web. People moved, people met. People had children together across distances that seem vast to us, but were perfectly traversable on foot over generational timescales. Genes flowed across the continent like water finding channels. And as genes flowed, so did ideas. So did technologies. So did the innovations of the mind that would eventually produce everything we consider distinctively human. The flat face and rounded brain case that make the Jebel Irhoud skull look like your neighbor did not appear fully formed in one place at one time. Different features of modern human anatomy evolved in different populations, in different locations, over different stretches of time, and then came together as those populations encountered each other. This is called mosaic evolution, and it fundamentally changes how we should think about ourselves. There was no single moment when we became human. There was no Garden of Eden, not the biblical one, and not the scientific substitute we invented to replace it. There was a gradual coalescence, a coming together, a long, slow convergence of features and capacities spread across an entire continent over hundreds of thousands of years. We emerged from a process, not an event. Now let me bring you closer to these actual people. Let me try to make them real, not just data points. At a site called Omo Kibish in southern Ethiopia, archaeologists have recovered human remains dating to approximately 233,000 years ago. These people lived along the shores of what was then a much larger Lake Turkana. They made stone tools of sophisticated design. They hunted and gathered across a landscape populated by hippos and crocodiles and vast herds of prehistoric antelope. What were their days like? We will never know with certainty. But we can know this. They were not silent. They were not isolated. They were not stumbling through existence in a fog of confusion, waiting for the invention of writing to make them fully conscious. These were human beings with fully operational human brains, brains neurologically indistinguishable from yours. They experienced emotions you would recognize instantly: love and jealousy, pride and shame, curiosity and boredom, and the particular ache that comes at 3 in the morning when you cannot sleep and you cannot stop thinking. They communicated in ways that were almost certainly language or something very close to it. The sophistication of their tool technology makes this essentially certain. You cannot teach someone to make a levallois core, a stoneworking technique that requires pre-planning the precise shape of the final flake before you strike it, through gesture alone. That is a verbal technology. It requires explanation. They planned for the future. The stone they used was not randomly grabbed. It was selected, often from sources miles away, for specific qualities of hardness and grain. It was transported, prepared, and worked toward a predetermined form. This is abstract thinking. This is holding an idea in your mind and working toward it through a sequence of physical actions. This is, in miniature, the same cognitive process that architects and engineers use today. They buried their dead. At School and Kafze caves in what is now Israel, human remains dating to roughly 100,000 years ago were found deliberately interred, not abandoned, not left where they fell, but placed in the earth with care. Some of these burials included objects: a boar's jaw, shell beads, ochre. The dead were prepared for something. What? We cannot say with certainty. But the act of burial itself tells us something profound. These people understood that death was different from sleep. They understood that the dead person was gone, and they responded to that understanding not with indifference, but with ceremony. That is not primitive behavior. That is human behavior. Here is the thing about these ancient people that I want you to hold on to as we continue. They were dealing with the same fundamental problem that you are dealing with right now. The problem of being conscious in a world you did not choose, surrounded by other conscious beings whose inner lives you can never fully access, trying to make meaning out of experiences that seem both enormous and arbitrary. Knowing that you will die, not knowing what that means. They were working on that problem 300,000 years ago. We are still working on it. The distance between you and the Jebel Irhoud people is not measured in intelligence or consciousness or the capacity for meaning. It is measured only in accumulated knowledge, the slow, generational pileup of information that each era passes to the next. They did not have what we have built since. We have built it on the foundation they laid. You are not separate from them. You are a later chapter in their story. Look in that museum case. Look at that skull. That face is your face, stretched back 300,000 years. That person was working on the same problems you are working on. That is where we came from. Now, let's talk about what happened next. There is a detail about the Jebel Irhoud site that deserves more attention than it usually receives. When archaeologists first began working there in the 1960s, and they were looking for Neanderthals, The site was known to produce ancient bones, and Neanderthals were the expected finding at that age and in that region. The first Jebel Irhoud skull was actually initially classified as a North African Neanderthal, a classification that persisted for decades. It was not until modern dating techniques were applied and more fossils were recovered that the truth became undeniable. These were not Neanderthals. They were us. Or rather, they were the continental network that produced us. The significance of this misclassification is not just historical irony. It is a lesson in how our prior assumptions shape what we see. For most of the 20th century, anthropologists were looking for a simple, linear story. Primitive forms evolving toward modern forms, in one place, in one direction. Jebel Irhoud did not fit that story, so for decades it was made to fit by reclassifying the specimens. When the evidence finally forced a rethinking, the implications were profound, not just for paleoanthropology, but for self-understanding. If our species did not emerge in a single Garden of Eden location, if we are instead the product of an interacting network of populations spread across an entire continent over hundreds of thousands of years, then what does it mean to ask where humans came from? The question may not have a clean answer. We came from everywhere. We came from the interaction. We came from the movement and the meeting and the exchange. This is, I think, a more honest and more interesting origin story than the simple one. We did not emerge fully formed from a single spring. We emerged from a process of connection across difference, which is, when you think about it, the same process that produces most of the good things in human life, even today. The Jebel Irhoud skull in its Rabat museum case is not just a fossil. It is an argument that human identity has always been plural, always been distributed, always been the product of encounter and synthesis rather than isolation and purity. That argument seems, in the early 21st century, worth making. There is an important distinction that most people have never heard of, and it matters enormously for understanding what we are. Scientists draw a line between anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity. The first refers to what you look like. The second refers to what you are capable of doing. And for a long stretch of human prehistory, perhaps 100,000 years or more, these two things were not synchronized. In other words, humans who were anatomically identical to us, who had the same size brain and the same neural architecture and the same genetic endowment, were living in ways that looked nothing like what we think of as human culture. They made competent stone tools, they survived, they reproduced, but they did not make art. They did not engage in long-distance trade. They did not bury their dead with grave goods. They did not leave behind the constellation of behaviors that scientists call behavioral modernity. Then something changed. Starting roughly 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, though some evidence pushes this earlier, the archaeological record begins to transform. It is not a gradual, incremental shift. It looks, from our vantage point in deep time, like an explosion. New tool types appear with sudden frequency. Bone and antler join stone as raw materials for the first time. Objects that serve no practical function, beads, pendants, pigment-covered shells, start showing up in the dirt. Long-distance trade networks leave their fingerprints in stone tools made from materials that originated hundreds of miles from where they were found. And then, most dramatically, come the caves. But before we get to the caves, we need to understand why this explosion happened, because that question is one of the most important and most contested in all of anthropology. Hypothesis 1: there was a biological change, a final refinement of the brain, perhaps a specific genetic mutation affecting the connectivity of neural networks, perhaps the last rewiring of the language centers, unlocked capacities that had been present in latent form. In this view, humans were anatomically ready for behavioral modernity long before it arrived. The fuse was already laid. Something lit it. Hypothesis 2: the revolution was cultural, not biological. The cognitive capacity for fully modern behavior had been present for a very long time. But culture works through accumulation. Language had to reach a certain complexity. Social networks had to reach a certain size. Knowledge had to build on knowledge, innovation on innovation, until a critical threshold was crossed and the whole system cascaded into something new. Think of it like compound interest. A small advantage, reinvested over many generations, becomes something enormous. Perhaps the behavioral revolution was not a spark, but an acceleration, a point where the accumulated interest of human culture finally became too large to be contained. Hypothesis 3, and this one is humbling, is that what looks like a revolution is partly an artifact of preservation. Earlier instances of fully modern behavior existed, but left no trace. The caves of southern Europe survived. The caves of sub-Saharan Africa mostly did not. The shells in the Mediterranean preserved their ochre pigment. The organic materials of the tropics decayed into nothing. Perhaps the real explosion happened not in behavior, but in our ability to find the evidence of behavior. The truth is almost certainly some combination of all three. But let us focus on what is not in dispute. By 50,000 years ago, at the absolute latest, human beings possessed the full package of behavioral modernity. And that package had specific contents, symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing stand for another, to look at a shell and see not just a shell, but a status marker, to look at a red handprint on a cave wall and see not just red pigment, but a statement. I was here. This hand is mine. I existed. This is so fundamental to human cognition that we barely notice it anymore. Language itself is symbolic thinking applied to sound. Money is symbolic thinking applied to metal or paper. Laws are symbolic thinking applied to behavior. Religion is symbolic thinking applied to the unknown. Art is symbolic thinking applied to stone, or paint, or breath. Remove symbolic thinking and civilization is impossible. Not difficult, impossible. Now add to that complex compositional language, not just calls and signals. Every animal has those, but the ability to talk about things that are not present. About the past, about the future, about what might be, about what someone else is thinking, about abstract categories that have no physical instantiation at all. Cognitive scientists call this displacement, the ability to communicate about things displaced in time and space from the immediate moment. A vervet monkey can alarm call to indicate a specific type of predator. That is impressive, but it cannot say, "My grandmother told me that once, in a drought year, there was a waterhole 3 days' walk east of the baobab tree, where the rocks look like a sleeping lion." That kind of communication, That transmission of specific, detailed, episodic knowledge across generations is a human superpower. And then add extended social networks. In most mammal species, the social group is constrained by the cognitive load of tracking individual relationships. You can only maintain a stable social group as large as your brain can manage the complexity of. For most primates, that number is somewhere around 50 individuals. For humans, something happened that broke this constraint. We developed what the anthropologist Robin Dunbar calls our social brain, a neural architecture that allows us to track the relationships, not just of individuals we know directly, but of individuals 2 and 3 steps removed. Friend of a friend, ally of an ally, enemy of an enemy. This gave early humans access to something no other species has ever had: the ability to form alliances, exchange resources, and cooperate across groups that did not share direct kinship. The ability to build what anthropologists call imagined communities, groups united not by proximity or blood, but by shared belief, shared symbol, shared story. This is the foundation on which everything else is built. Trade networks are imagined communities. Religions are imagined communities. Nations are imagined communities. Corporations are imagined communities. All of it traces back to a cognitive capacity that appears to have fully crystallized in our ancestors somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. Now here is the thing that should genuinely shake you. None of this required civilization. None of it required agriculture, or writing, or cities, or governments. The cognitive revolution that made us capable of everything we have since built happened during the deep prehistory that most people never think about. During the 100,000 years before the first grain was planted, during the eons of what we dismissively call the Stone Age, we were fully human in every meaningful cognitive and emotional sense, long before we were civilized. And perhaps more importantly, we were fully human in ways that did not require civilization to be expressed. The people who walked out of Africa 70,000 years ago were not pre-civilized humans yearning for walls and fields and kings. They were complete humans, inventive, communicative, spiritually curious, deeply social, who had developed a profoundly successful way of living that did not involve any of those things. We are about to spend a lot of time inside that world. We are going to try to understand it not as a primitive precursor to the world we know, but as a fully realized human world on its own terms, because that is what it was. Step inside. Here is a specific example of what the full package of behavioral modernity could achieve, one that makes the cognitive revolution concrete rather than abstract. About 26,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now the Czech Republic, a human being stood on a riverbank and made a figurine. It was small enough to cup in both hands, and carved from mammoth ivory with stone burins. It depicted a human form, though abstracted in ways we do not fully understand. It is called the Venus of Vestonus, after the site where it was found. Creating this figurine required the decision to make something that serves no immediate survival function, the cognitive capacity to hold an imagined form in mind and systematically work toward it, the technical mastery to shape ivory without cracking it, the cultural context that made such an object meaningful to the people who commissioned or received it. None of these capacities are simple. Together, they represent a cluster of abilities: symbolic thought, prospective cognition, technical sophistication, cultural participation, that define what we mean by behavioral modernity. But here is what is perhaps most striking. The Venus of Vestinus is not the earliest figurative art. It is not even close to the earliest. By the time it was made, humans had already been creating sophisticated art for at least 15,000 years. The tradition was already ancient, already mature. This means that by 26,000 years ago, behavioral modernity was not new. It was established. It had traditions and conventions. It had masters and students. It had a history that no one had yet learned to write, but a history nonetheless. The behavioral revolution did not produce a species that was suddenly capable. It produced a species that was capable of accumulation, of building on what came before, rather than starting each generation from scratch. That is the deepest meaning of symbolic culture. Not just the ability to make symbols, but the ability to store meaning in symbols and transmit that meaning across time. Language is a symbol system. Art is a symbol system. Religion is a symbol system. And once you have symbol systems, you have a second kind of evolution, not biological, not encoded in DNA, but cultural, encoded in stories and objects and practices passed from person to person, generation to generation. Cultural evolution is faster than biological evolution by orders of magnitude. A genetic mutation that proves advantageous might spread through a population over thousands of generations. A cultural innovation, a new tool, a new technique, a new story can spread through a population in a single generation. This is the cognitive spark that really matters. Not just the ability to think symbolically, but the ability to share symbolic thought, to externalize it, to make it available to others who were not there when it was generated. Once humans could do this, the pace of change accelerated in ways that biological evolution could not match. And the world has been accelerating ever since. Dawn breaks over the camp. The fire has burned down to coals, but still breathes heat into the cool air. Around it, perhaps 30 people are beginning to stir. Some rise quickly, stretching, speaking in low voices. Others steal a few more minutes under sleeping furs. There is no alarm clock. There is no schedule imposed from outside. There is no commute, no boss, no quarterly review, no mortgage, no inbox. And yet, by the time the sun clears the horizon, everyone is in motion. Each person engaged in the work that sustains the group through another day. This is how most humans have lived for most of human history. We call them hunter-gatherers, which is accurate but somehow clinical, a label that strips away the texture of actual lives and replaces it with a job description. These were not a category of economic actors. They were people. People who were, by almost any measure we can apply at this distance, spectacularly good at being alive. Let me begin with the most counterintuitive fact about the hunter-gatherer way of life, the one that upended a century of assumptions when it was first documented. They worked less than you do. In the 1960s, anthropologist Marshall Solins began reviewing the field data from studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups. The Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, Aboriginal Australians, and others. What he found forced a complete rethinking of received wisdom about prehistoric life. In most environments, adult hunter-gatherers devoted roughly 15 to 20 hours per week to subsistence activities: hunting, gathering, food preparation, less than half the time demanded by a modern 40-hour work week. The rest of their waking hours were, by any reasonable definition, leisure. They talked, they played, they made music, they told stories, they cultivated relationships, they sat in the sun. Salins called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Affluent not in the sense of owning much, but in the sense that their needs were met without consuming the majority of their lives in labor. He was making a pointed argument against the Victorian assumption that prehistory was one long, miserable slog toward the glorious present, but his argument was built on real data, and it stuck. Now, and this is important, the picture is not entirely rosy. Salins was working primarily with groups in relatively benign environments. In harsh climates, Arctic tundra, true desert, high altitude, the calculus shifts. And even in good conditions, the shadow of scarcity never fully disappears. A drought, a disease, a migration of game animals could transform abundance into crisis with terrifying speed. The hunter-gatherer life was not without suffering, but here is what is not disputed. For most hunter-gatherer people, in most conditions, life was not the desperate scramble from starvation that we imagine. It was something considerably more spacious than that. And the reason for this is knowledge. The single most important thing to understand about hunter-gatherer existence is the sheer depth and breadth of the knowledge required to sustain it. This is not simple living. This is extraordinarily sophisticated living that happens to leave a small physical footprint. A skilled gatherer, and by skilled, I mean someone who has spent a lifetime learning from elders who themselves spent lifetimes learning, can identify hundreds of plant species. She knows which ones are edible and which are lethal. She knows which require processing to remove toxins and exactly how to process them. She knows which fruits are ripe in March and which in September, which roots are worth the effort of digging, and in which season, which barks carry medicinal properties and which carry death. She knows which plants indicate the presence of underground water. She knows which insects are a reliable food source and which will make you sick. This knowledge is encyclopedic. It took generations to accumulate and generations to transmit. Lose it, and you die. Possess it, and you are a food acquisition system of extraordinary efficiency. A skilled hunter carries an equally vast body of knowledge. He can read tracks in dust that are invisible to untrained eyes, not just identify the species, but the size of the animal, its gait, how recently it passed, whether it was injured. He knows the migration patterns of every animal in his territory, their mating cycles, their preferred sleeping spots, their responses to weather changes. He can predict where a specific animal will be tomorrow based on where it was this morning. This is not mysticism. This is the product of a lifetime of careful observation, refined by the observations of every generation before him. It is science without laboratories, data collection without spreadsheets, but it is no less rigorous for that. The division of labor between hunters and gatherers varied enormously across cultures and should not be caricatured. Men hunted large game, women gathered. This was the general pattern in most studied societies, driven largely by the logistical constraints of nursing and childcare. But men gathered too, and women hunted small animals, and the categories were not rigid. More importantly, in most foraging societies, gathered plant foods provided the majority of calories. The dramatic meat-hunting image that dominates our imagination of prehistoric life is largely mythology. The reliable, daily foundation of survival was overwhelmingly the work of women. Now let us talk about this social dimension, because this is where things get genuinely strange from a modern perspective. Hunter-gatherer societies were, by the standards of any civilization we have ever produced, remarkably egalitarian. Not perfectly egalitarian, not utopias. Violence was real and persistent. Interpersonal conflict could be lethal. Relations between groups ranged from cooperation to lethal raiding. None of this should be romanticized. But within groups, the accumulation of power and resources by individuals was actively suppressed through a set of social mechanisms that anthropologist Christopher Bohm called reverse dominance hierarchy. When an individual, usually a man, began to accumulate too much status, too much deference, too many resources, the group mobilized against him. Through gossip first, then ridicule, then social exclusion, and in extreme cases through collective violence, ambitious individuals were brought back into line. This was not passive. It was vigilant, consistent, and deliberate. The group enforced equality because the group understood, at some intuitive level, that inequality in a mobile foraging band was an existential threat. A dominant individual who hoarded resources in a world where everyone depended on sharing could get people killed. So they didn't allow it. Think about what this means for how these people experienced daily life. There were no orders to follow. There were no kings, no landlords, no bosses, no wage structure. An individual's status rested entirely on their demonstrated competence, their generosity, and their reputation, not on inheritance, not on the accumulation of property. The best hunter in the group could not keep his kill. The custom required elaborate redistribution. The animal was butchered according to rules that ensured everyone received a portion, with the hunter often receiving no more than others, and sometimes less. Hoarding was shameful. Generosity was the highest virtue, and everyone knew this because everyone had grown up watching it performed. This is not how we live, and the distance between how we live and how our ancestors lived for 96% of our existence as a species is, I would argue, the source of a great deal of modern suffering that we persistently misdiagnose. We will come back to this, but first, what about family? What about children? What about the most intimate dimensions of daily life? Hunter-gatherer children experienced something that would look profoundly alien to a modern American parent. They were not scheduled. They were not supervised in any continuous way. They were not enrolled in activities. They were simply present in the life of the group, watching everything, imitating everything, following older children and adults around, and absorbing, through that proximity, the knowledge and skills they would need as adults. Research on traditional child development consistently finds that this approach, what developmental psychologists now call self-directed play in mixed-age groups, produces children with exceptional situational awareness, strong social skills, and deep practical competence. It is, in other words, what human children's brains evolved to do. Formal schooling is a historical novelty. Children sitting in rows, receiving instruction, and being tested on their retention. This is less than 200 years old as a widespread institution. For 300,000 years, children learned the way all mammals learn, through play, observation, and participation. And they were not alone in being raised. Hunter-gatherer children had many caregivers: grandmothers, aunts, older cousins, family friends. All participated in feeding, protecting, and educating the young. Evolutionary biologists have a specific theory about why this matters. The grandmother hypothesis argues that human menopause, unique among primates, evolved precisely because post-reproductive women were so valuable as caregivers and knowledge transmitters that their survival increased the reproductive success of the whole group. In other words, your grandmother exists, evolutionarily speaking, because having grandmothers kept our ancestors alive. The hunter-gatherer world was not paradise. I want to be clear about this because the temptation to romanticize is real, and the reality does not earn it. Infant mortality was high. Injuries that are trivially treated today were potentially fatal. Violence between groups claimed real lives. Old age, when it came, was hard. But it was a life of extraordinary richness in the dimensions that human beings evolved to care about most: intimate community, meaningful work with immediately visible results, deep knowledge of the natural world, freedom from the abstract pressures, debt, status anxiety, the relentless performance of productivity that characterize modern life. When we feel alienated from our work, when we feel isolated in our apartments, when we feel the particular modern sadness of being surrounded by millions of people and still profoundly alone, we are not experiencing personal failure. We are experiencing the mismatch between what we are built for and the world we actually inhabit. Understanding the original affluent society does not mean we should return to it. We cannot. But it might help us understand why so many of us feel, underneath all the abundance and convenience of modern life, a persistent sense that something essential is missing. We are not wrong about that. Something is missing. And it has a name. Let me say something about violence, because the picture I have been painting risks becoming too comfortable, and discomfort with the truth is not a virtue. Hunter-gatherer societies were not peaceful. The ethnographic record, the study of traditional societies observed by anthropologists before or during contact with modern civilization, documents rates of interpersonal violence that are, by modern standards, very high. Studies of prehistoric skeletal trauma show consistent evidence of violent injury across cultures and time periods. The anthropologist Lawrence Keeley, in a study that was deeply unfashionable when it appeared, but has proven difficult to refute, estimated that warfare-related mortality in typical hunter-gatherer societies was likely higher as a proportion of population than in even the most violent nation-states of the 20th century. This needs to be held alongside everything else we have discussed about the forager life: the intimacy and cooperation, the egalitarianism and generosity, The leisure and the knowledge and the deep embeddedness in the natural world. These things coexisted with violence. They were not contradicted by it, because the same social features that produced remarkable cooperation within the band also produced the capacity for fierce, lethal conflict between bands. This is not a paradox, it is a pattern. The very social instincts that make humans capable of extraordinary in-group cooperation, the intense loyalty, the strong group identity, the us versus them psychology, also make us capable of extraordinary outgroup hostility. We are, in this sense, exactly the animals our evolutionary history made us, capable of both the transcendent generosity of the fireside circle and the lethal coordination of the raiding party. The same species that painted the caves at Lascaux also left evidence of massacres at Crow Creek, where the skeletal remains of nearly 500 people were found in a mass grave, the bones bearing unmistakable evidence of violent death. This is not comfortable, but it is honest, and it matters for how we understand human nature. The optimists are right that humans are capable of remarkable cooperation, generosity, and altruism. The pessimists are right that humans are capable of systematic violence and cruelty. Both are drawing from the same well. Both are describing the same species. Understanding this does not lead to despair. It leads to precision. If we know what we are capable of, both the light and the dark, we can design institutions and cultures and practices that amplify the former and constrain the latter. That is not a task the hunter-gatherers had to perform at scale. It is, perhaps, the central task of civilization. We are still working on it. Pick up a rock. Any rock, the kind you might pass on a hiking trail or find at the edge of a parking lot. Now try to turn it into a knife, not a metaphorical knife, an actual cutting implement, sharp enough to skin an animal and slice through tendon and hide. Go ahead, try. If you have never done this before, and the overwhelming majority of people reading this have not, you will quickly discover something humbling. The rock does not cooperate. Strike it wrong, and it shatters into useless fragments. Strike it at the right angle, and the flake comes off cleanly, but the edge is too thick, or curves the wrong direction, or snaps at the crucial moment. Get the flake shape right, and you still have to thin the blade, shape the point, create a hafting notch, each step requiring not just force, but geometry, intuition, and a deep understanding of how this specific type of stone wants to break. It is, in short, extraordinarily difficult, and our ancestors did it for 2.5 million years. The stone tool tradition is the longest technological tradition in the history of life on Earth. 2.5 million years of accumulated knowledge, refined through uncountable generations of experimentation, failure, improvement, and transmission. We call it the Stone Age, as if it were a single, undifferentiated era, as if 2.5 million years of technological development were equivalent to saying the Metal Era and leaving it at that. Let me give you a sense of the actual sophistication involved. The earliest stone tools, the Oldowan industry, beginning roughly 2.5 million years ago, were simple cobbles struck to produce a sharp edge. Impressive for their time. No other species was doing this, but the conceptual demand was relatively low. You identify a suitable rock, you strike it in the right place, you get a sharp edge. The Acheulean hand axe, which appears around 1.75 million years ago, is a different order of complexity. To make a good hand axe, that teardrop-shaped bilaterally symmetric tool that appears across Africa, Europe, and Asia for over 1 million years, you must shape stone on both faces simultaneously. You must maintain symmetry, not just in 2 dimensions, but 3. You must plan the sequence of flake removals so that each one sets up the next. You must hold a mental template of the finished form and work steadily toward it while accounting for the specific inclinations of this particular stone. This requires abstract, spatial reasoning. It requires planning multiple steps ahead. It requires, in cognitive terms, the same architecture that a chess player uses to think several moves into the future. And it was being done reliably and repeatedly over 1 million years before anatomically modern humans existed. But the Acheulean looks primitive compared to what came later. The Levallois technique, appearing around 300,000 years ago and associated with both Neanderthals and early modern humans, represents a conceptual leap that still impresses materials scientists. In Levallois, the toolmaker first shapes the core, the raw stone, into a specific 3-dimensional form, like a tortoise shell. This shaping process is essentially preparatory. Its entire purpose is to predetermine the shape of a single flake that has not yet been struck. Then, with one precisely placed blow, the toolmaker removes a flake that is already the exact shape they wanted, thin, sharp, with edges in the right locations. The final product was designed before the final blow was struck. This is manufacturing. This is production planning. This is holding an abstract design in your mind and bending a physical process to realize it. Modern engineers do the same thing with CAD software and CNC machines. Levallois knappers did it with stone and bone and the accumulated knowledge of their tradition. The Upper Paleolithic, beginning around 50,000 years ago, brings yet another transformation. Blades, long, thin, parallel-sided flakes struck from carefully prepared cores, become the dominant production unit. From these blades, toolmakers created an extraordinary range of specialist tools. Burins for engraving bone and wood, scrapers for processing hides, perforators for drilling holes, backed blades that could be hafted as spear points or arrow tips, and perhaps the most underappreciated innovation of the entire Paleolithic, needles. The bone needle. Let us spend a moment here. To make a bone needle, you must select a suitable long bone, preferably from a small animal. You must split it with controlled blows to produce a blank. You must grind that blank smooth, a process requiring abrasive stone and considerable time. You must shape the point to the necessary fineness without snapping the blank. And then you must perforate it. Drill a hole no more than 1 millimeter or 2 in diameter through bone, using tools made of stone, without cracking the blank. Each needle takes hours. Each needle is fragile. It breaks if you push it too hard through thick hide. And yet, needles were being made by the thousands, across thousands of generations, in camps from Siberia to Spain. Why? Because without needles, you cannot make fitted clothing. Without fitted clothing, you cannot survive an Ice Age winter in northern latitudes. The needle is not a luxury. The needle is the difference between life and death in a frozen world. The same logic applies to the spear thrower, or atlatl. a device for extending the effective length of the throwing arm, dramatically increasing both the power and range of a thrown spear. A skilled atlatl user can hurl a dart with enough velocity and force to penetrate the thick hide of a bison at 30 meters. Without this technology, hunting large megafauna is a desperate, close-range, highly dangerous enterprise. With it, hunters could engage prey from a distance that provided both safety and tactical flexibility. The bow and arrow, appearing perhaps 70,000 years ago in Africa and becoming widespread much later, carries this logic further still. Storing energy in a bent stave and releasing it suddenly to achieve projectile velocities impossible with a thrown weapon. The physics are elegant, the manufacturing demands are significant, and the implications for hunting and for warfare are profound. But I want to step back from individual technologies and talk about something more fundamental: the nature of knowledge itself in the hunter-gatherer world. Modern societies privilege explicit, formal, written knowledge, the things you can state precisely, measure quantitatively, verify experimentally. This is the only kind of knowledge we fully trust. Hunter-gatherer societies operated primarily on tacit knowledge, knowledge stored in bodies, in skills, in habits, in intuitions honed through years of practice and refined across generations. Knowledge that you cannot fully articulate even when you fully possess it. The way an experienced craftsperson's hands know where to apply pressure before their conscious mind has processed the situation. This is not inferior knowledge. It is differently stored knowledge. An experienced Levallois napper does not consciously calculate the angles of fracture for each blow. Their hands have internalized thousands of hours of feedback. They feel the stone the way a jazz musician feels harmony, not as a set of rules being applied, but as a direct perception of what is right. This knowledge was not written in books or stored in databases. It lived in human bodies, passed from the hands of the experienced to the hands of the learning through years of direct demonstration. It was extraordinarily sophisticated, and it was extraordinarily fragile. When the person who held it died without transmitting it, it was gone. And here is a sobering thought. Most of it is gone. The ecological knowledge that hunter-gatherers accumulated over millennia, the encyclopedic understanding of plant chemistry, animal behavior, weather patterns, seasonal cycles, represented a depth of environmental literacy that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Ethnobotanists who have worked with traditional communities before their knowledge was lost have documented pharmacopoeias of hundreds of plant species with specific applications, dosages, preparation methods, and contraindications. Some of this knowledge has led directly to modern pharmaceuticals. Most of it has not been documented at all. We tend to look at a Paleolithic camp and see poverty, a few animal skins, some chipped stone, an ember, sparse, minimal, primitive. What we should see is density of knowledge so great it is invisible to us, embedded in people who do not need to carry possessions because they carry something more valuable: the understanding of how to survive anywhere with anything, using the accumulated wisdom of 100,000 years. That is not poverty. That is a different kind of wealth, and it is one we have almost completely lost. One more technology deserves special attention because it is perhaps the most psychologically interesting. The technology of fire. A fire control is so fundamental to the human story that it is easy to take for granted, to treat as mere background. But consider what fire actually gave our ancestors and how recently it was acquired. The earliest unambiguous evidence of controlled fire use, hearths, burned bones, fire-hardened clay, appears in the archaeological record around 1 million years ago at sites like Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa and later at Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel. But controlled fire in the sense of making fire on demand rather than capturing and maintaining it from natural sources may have come significantly later. The ability to reliably start a fire using friction or percussion, not just to keep an existing flame alive, is a technology of considerable complexity. Fire changed everything it touched. Most obviously, heat and light in darkness, the ability to live in environments that would otherwise be lethally cold, protection from predators who feared flame. But the deepest change may be dietary. Cooking transforms food in ways that have profound implications for human biology. It breaks down the complex molecules in plant foods, making nutrients available that would otherwise pass through the gut unabsorbed. It denatures proteins in meat, dramatically increasing their digestibility. It kills pathogens, and it dramatically reduces the time and energy required for chewing and digestion. Before cooking, a large-brained primate had a problem. Big brains are metabolically expensive. A human brain, which constitutes 2% of body weight, consumes 20% of total caloric intake. Sustaining that brain requires a reliable, dense, easily digestible source of energy. Raw food, even a varied diet of wild plants and animal products, may not have been sufficient to sustain the energy demands of the brain we eventually developed. Cooking solved this problem. Cooked food delivers more calories per gram of raw material, more reliably, with less physiological cost. The evolutionary anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued, persuasively, that control of fire and the development of cooking were not just consequences of increasing brain size, but causes of it. That cooking made the metabolic investment in larger brains affordable in a way it had not been before. If this is correct, and the evidence is compelling, then the fireside is not just a social technology. It is a cognitive technology. The campfire, with its cooked food and its circle of illuminated faces, was part of the infrastructure that produced the human mind. We sit around fires and feel something ancient, something that resonates below articulation. Perhaps what we are feeling is not just social warmth. Perhaps we are feeling, in some inarticulate way, the source. September 12, 1940. 4 teenage boys from the village of Montignac in the Dordogne region of occupied France are following a dog into a hole in the hillside. The hole is a small depression in the limestone, barely wide enough for a person. The dog disappeared into it days earlier, then returned. The boys figure it might lead to treasure. There is a local legend about a secret tunnel connecting to a nearby manor house. They widen the entrance with their hands and slide down into the dark. What they find will change our understanding of what it means to be human. The walls are alive. Horses gallop across the stone. Not crude scratches, but fully realized, anatomically accurate animals in motion. rendered with a confidence and economy of line that would impress a modern illustrator. Bulls twist and charge with their massive shoulders caught mid-swing. Deer leap with antlers spread against the ceiling. Red and black and yellow ochre, 600 animals, hundreds of symbols, covering every surface of a cave system that runs for 250 meters into the earth. The boys have found Lascaux, and Lascaux is approximately 17,000 years old. But here is the thing about Lascaux. It is not the oldest, not even close. In 1994, 3 cavers pushing through a narrow fissure in the Ardèche Gorge of southern France found themselves in a chamber that had been sealed for 27,000 years. They named it Chauvet, after one of the discoverers. When the art on the walls was dated, the results were literally unbelievable. Scientists ran the tests again. The results came back the same. Chauvet is more than 36,000 years old. This is not remarkable in the way that old things are remarkable. This is remarkable in a way that should fundamentally revise your understanding of human consciousness. Because the art at Chauvet is not primitive, it is not cruder or simpler than Lascaux. In some respects, it is more sophisticated. The artists at Chauvet understood perspective. They depicted animals overlapping, with those in the background rendered smaller to suggest depth. They showed motion through sequential depiction, animals in successive positions as if captured in frames of animation. They mastered shading, using techniques that would not reappear in Western art until the Renaissance, 15,000 years later. Art did not slowly evolve from simple to complex over millennia. From the very first evidence we have, it was already accomplished. The cognitive and technical capacities required for realistic representation were fully present the moment we find them, which suggests they were present long before we find them. Even older evidence appears in Indonesia, where paintings of pigs and hand stencils in Sulawesi caves have been dated to at least 45,000 years ago. In South Africa, pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns date to 75,000 years ago or more. Not paintings, but unmistakably intentional, unmistakably symbolic. We did not learn to make art. We emerged from Africa already making art. Now, why? This is the question that has haunted researchers for a century. Not, how did they do it? We understand the pigments, the brushes of moss and hair, the stone lamps filled with animal fat that provided light in absolute darkness. The how is solved. The why is not. The most compelling current understanding synthesizes several threads of evidence in a way that should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Start with location. The most decorated chambers in the great painted caves are not near the entrances, not in the places where natural light falls and life is lived. They are deep inside the earth, sometimes frighteningly deep. To reach the most decorated chamber at Lascaux, you walk 250 meters into the hillside. To reach the deepest art at other sites, you crawl through passages barely wide enough for a human body, in absolute darkness, sometimes for hours. This is not where you would put decorative art. This is not where you would casually doodle. This is where you would go for a reason. A serious, prepared, intentional reason. Now add the acoustic evidence. Researchers studying painted caves have consistently found that the most heavily decorated chambers are also the best acoustic chambers, places where the natural geometry of the rock amplifies sound, creates echoes, produces resonances that do not occur elsewhere in the cave system. The art is where the sound is best. Now add the evidence from neuropsychology. In altered states of consciousness, induced through rhythmic drumming, fasting, sensory deprivation, or certain plant compounds, the human brain reliably generates specific categories of visual phenomena. Geometric patterns, phosphenes, entoptic forms, and then, at deeper stages, figurative visions that the experiencer perceives as profoundly real and meaningful. These phenomena are not culturally variable. They appear cross-culturally in people who have never encountered each other because they arise from the shared neural architecture of the human brain. The geometric signs on cave walls, the dots, lines, grids, zigzags that appear alongside the animals, match with uncanny precision the entoptic phenomena generated by altered states. What were they seeing? What were they doing? The South African archaeologist David Lewis Williams, drawing on extensive comparative research across traditional cultures worldwide, proposed a synthesis that many researchers now accept as the most compelling available. The caves were not galleries. They were not homes. They were thresholds. In many traditional cultures, the rock face is not understood as a boundary between the human world and empty stone. It is understood as a membrane, thin, permeable, alive, between the visible world and the spirit world. The animals and figures in the rock are not paintings on the surface. They are entities that exist within the rock, perceived and captured in the moments of their passage between worlds. The deep caves were sites for altered state induction, through darkness, through sound, through the disorientation of hours spent crawling through total black, through techniques we cannot now fully reconstruct. In those states, images were perceived in the rock, and they were recorded. This is not superstition. This is technology. Spiritual technology, a repeatable, transmissible method for accessing states of consciousness that the community found valuable for reasons that made complete pragmatic sense in their world. The shaman, for this is what we would call such a practitioner, did not disappear into the rock for personal enrichment. They went for the community. They came back with knowledge of the spirit world, with assurance that the hunt would succeed, with guidance about where to travel, when to move, what decisions to make. The cave was the interface, and the altered state was the operating system. Now consider this from the inside. You are standing in a chamber 200 meters below the surface of the earth. The air is absolutely still and smells of clay and ancient animal fat. You have been here for hours. Your torch gutters, throwing moving shadows across a wall where dozens of animals seem to breathe and tremble at the edge of visibility. The chamber is resonant. Every sound you make comes back to you from every direction, layered. It's complex, disorienting. You have not eaten in days. You have been drumming for hours, and then the wall becomes permeable. The bison is not painted on the stone. The bison is emerging from the stone. You watch it happen. You record what you see with pigment made from ochre and charcoal and animal fat, mixed and carried in hollow bones. You are performing surgery on reality. You are making the invisible visible. You are holding, for the community, the possibility that the world is larger than the world they can see. Pablo Picasso reportedly visited Lascaux shortly after its discovery in 1940 and walked out visibly shaken. "We have invented nothing," he is said to have declared to his companion. "Everything was already there." He was right. The impulse toward transcendence, toward experience that ruptures the ordinary, that touches something beyond the daily, is not a product of civilization. It is not an invention of organized religion or formalized theology. It is as old as the fully human mind, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than any city that will ever be found. The caves are where we first tried to draw a map of the invisible world. We have been making maps of it ever since. And somewhere in the frequency of drumming that is still sounding in the oldest human music, somewhere in the part of you that stands in a cathedral or a redwood forest and feels, despite everything, that you are not alone, somewhere in that is a direct, unbroken line back to a person with a torch and a bone full of ochre, standing at the threshold of the dark. There is a final dimension of cave art that I have not yet addressed, and it may be the most important, the question of audience. Who were these images for? The received answer, the one that feels most intuitive, is that they were for the people who made them and their community. Social documents, expressions of shared belief, visual records of spiritual experience. But there is another possibility, strange and worth sitting with. Some researchers have proposed that the images were, at least in part, for the animals themselves. In many traditional cultures, indigenous cultures of North America, Siberia, Australia, and elsewhere, the relationship between human hunters and hunted animals is not understood as purely economic. It is understood as social, reciprocal. The hunter does not simply take the animal. The animal gives itself. And that gift requires acknowledgement, ceremony, proper conduct. To paint a bison on a cave wall might be, in this framework, not a picture of a bison. It might be a message to the bison, a recognition of the bison's power and spirit, an act of courtesy toward a being whose cooperation the hunter required. We cannot know if this is what the cave painters believed. The interpretive gap is too large, but the fact that so many traditional cultures have maintained this kind of relational understanding of human-animal interaction independently across cultures that never contacted each other suggests that it may reflect something real about the way humans with deep ecological knowledge experience their relationship to the natural world, not as dominators, as participants, as part of a web of relationships that required tending. This stands in dramatic contrast to the dominant modern Western view of the natural world as resource, a view that has, over the past few centuries, produced the mass extinctions and ecosystem collapse we are now scrambling to address. Perhaps the cave painters knew something we have forgotten. Perhaps the paintings were not just art. Perhaps they were negotiations. Perhaps they were, in the oldest sense of the word, prayers. And perhaps, though I offer this tentatively, the fact that we are now facing a crisis defined by our failure to maintain our relationship with the living world suggests that we might have something to learn from people who understood that relationship far more deeply than we do. Stand with me for a moment at the edge of Africa. Behind us, the continent where our species was born. The savannas, the highland forests, the river systems, the coastlines. Every landscape our ancestors' ancestors ever knew. Every grave of every person who ever lived and loved and died before us. Before us, nothing, or rather, everything. A world with no humans in it. The migration out of Africa is not a single event we can pinpoint on a calendar. It is a process, a series of movements, over tens of thousands of years, driven by different pressures in different generations, unfolding with the slow inevitability of a tide. But somewhere around 70,000 years ago, possibly earlier, a group of modern humans made a crossing that would eventually change every ecosystem on Earth. The most likely route was the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage at the southern end of the Red Sea, where the gap between Africa and Arabia was at its narrowest. During periods of lowered sea levels, this crossing may have been as little as 20 kilometers, achievable on simple rafts, achievable, possibly, by wading at extreme low tide across exposed coral. The people who made this crossing were not explorers in any modern sense. They were not setting out to discover new continents. They were not carrying a flag or a mission statement. They were doing what humans had always done, following food, following water, moving along coastlines because coastlines are reliable and coastlines make sense. But this time, the movement did not stop. Once in Arabia, some populations turned east and followed the coastline of the Indian Ocean. This is the coastal migration hypothesis, and it is supported by a growing body of genetic and archaeological evidence. The coast offered something that the interior did not: predictability. Shellfish do not migrate. Tidal zones renew themselves. A coastline is a conveyor belt of nutrition, stretching endlessly in both directions. Following this coastal route, modern humans reached South Asia, then Southeast Asia, with a speed that is, in geological terms, explosive. Within perhaps 20,000 years of leaving Africa, our ancestors were in Australia. Stop. Let that sit for a moment. The colonization of Australia required open ocean seafaring. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, the water barriers separating the Southeast Asian landmass from the Australian continent were too wide to walk, too deep to wade. Someone, some group, at some moment in deep time, built watercraft and deliberately set out across open water toward a land they could not see. Try to inhabit that decision. You live in a world with no maps, no navigational instruments, no radio, no way to call for help if things go wrong. The horizon in the direction you are considering shows nothing, only water, extending to the edge of the visible world. You do not know if land exists beyond it. You have only the currents, the bird migrations, perhaps a distant smudge of clouds that suggests something large and warm somewhere over the horizon. And you get in the boat. What drives that decision? Curiosity, certainly. Possibly pressure. Other groups crowding the coast behind you, forcing the move. Possibly something that we might call spiritual calling. A sense that the journey itself was required by something beyond immediate need. We will never know the specific motivations of those specific people, but we know what they found. A continent no human being had ever touched. An ecosystem of extraordinary richness, populated by animals that had evolved without human predators, and therefore had no instinctive fear of them. a landscape that their descendants would inhabit and steward and name and know for at least 65,000 years, making Aboriginal Australians custodians of the oldest continuous culture on the surface of this planet. 65,000 years, while Rome rose and fell, while the pyramids were built and eroded, while the entirety of recorded Western history unfolded, Aboriginal Australians were tending their country, maintaining their song lines, singing the landscape into being, generation after generation, without break. The depth of that continuity is almost incomprehensible. Meanwhile, other branches of the Exodus moved in different directions, north and west into Central Asia, west into the European landmass, where they would encounter something unexpected. The Neanderthals were not gone. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals had dominated the cold latitudes of Europe and Western Asia. They were formidable beings, not the shambling brutes of popular imagination, but cognitively complex, emotionally capable, physically powerful. They buried their dead. They made tools of considerable sophistication. They survived Ice Age conditions that would be lethal to an unequipped modern human. They had been there long enough to call Europe home in every meaningful sense. When modern humans arrived, the old story said they simply outcompeted the Neanderthals into extinction. Superior technology, superior language, superior social organization. The moderns won, the Neanderthals lost, and that was that. The genome told a different story. In 2010, a team led by Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo published the first high-quality reconstruction of the Neanderthal genome, assembled from fragments of ancient DNA extracted from 40,000-year-old bone. The finding was seismic. People of non-African descent, every European, every Asian, every indigenous American, carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. This did not come from nowhere. It came from sex. From children born to modern human mothers or fathers and Neanderthal partners. From those children surviving and reproducing. From the descendants of those unions eventually becoming every non-African person alive today. We did not replace the Neanderthals. We absorbed them. They are not gone. They are in you, in the shape of certain immune system genes, in certain disease resistances, possibly in certain cognitive tendencies. The encounter between modern humans and Neanderthals was not a conquest. It was a merger, uneven and partial, and ultimately devastating for the Neanderthal side, but a merger nonetheless. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals as a distinct population were gone. The causes are still debated: disease, competition, climate change, simple demographic swamping by the faster reproducing moderns. But gone they were, leaving behind only those traces written into our DNA. The colonization of the Americas was the last great chapter of the human diaspora, and it remains the most hotly debated. The traditional story had humans crossing the Bering Land Bridge around 13,000 years ago, following an ice-free corridor that opened between the great glaciers covering North America. These were the Clovis people, named for a distinctive stone tool technology first identified near Clovis, New Mexico. But the evidence keeps pushing the timeline back. Fossilized human footprints discovered at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, preserved in dried lake sediment and dated by the plant material beneath them, place humans in North America between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. If these dates hold, and multiple teams using multiple methods have confirmed them, then humans were deep in the interior of North America during the height of the last ice age, when the Bering Land Bridge was open, but the inland corridor was not. The coastal route hypothesis offers a resolution. People did not travel through the ice sheets. They traveled along the Pacific coast in boats, hugging the kelp forest ecosystems that provide rich and reliable marine resources. The ice was to their left, open water was to their right. They moved south, generation by generation, until they emerged below the glaciers and spread across 2 continents. Whatever the exact route, whatever the exact timing, the end result is clear. Within a few thousand years of arriving in North America, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, the literal end of the inhabited world. Every habitable environment on 2 continents was occupied. The human conquest of the planet was complete. What does it mean that we moved this far, this fast, driven by nothing more than the ancient impulse to see what is on the other side of the next ridge? It means, I think, that restlessness is not a bug in human nature. It is a feature. The individuals willing to leave the known for the unknown, generation after generation, were the ones who found the next valley, the next coast, the next continent. Over hundreds of thousands of years, wandering paid off, and so it was selected for. The impulse to explore, to go somewhere new, to cross the water, to walk into the dark, is not recklessness. It is inheritance. It is the accumulated decision-making of every ancestor who moved rather than stayed, who crossed rather than turned back, who sailed toward the horizon because something in them could not do otherwise. That instinct is still in you. You feel it when you change jobs, when you move cities, when you book the ticket you cannot really afford to a place you have never been. You feel it when you open a book or a documentary about something you know nothing about. You are, in the oldest sense, still migrating. The genetic evidence for the out-of-Africa migration has its own story to tell, one that adds texture and nuance to the archaeological record. The pattern of genetic variation in human populations around the world is consistent with a specific model. Most of the genetic diversity in our species is found in Africa. Non-African populations are, genetically speaking, subsets of African populations, not separate variants, but samples drawn from the African diversity pool, carrying some of its variation and lacking the rest. This is precisely what you would expect if a relatively small group of people left Africa and founded all the non-African populations of the world. A small founding population carries only a fraction of the genetic diversity of the source population. As that small group expands and diversifies across new environments, it builds new variation, but it starts from a narrowed base. This pattern is called a founder effect, and it is visible in the genetics of every non-African human population studied. The people of any given region outside Africa share a common ancestor population that was smaller than the African population it derived from. What this means, in human terms, is that the entire non-African world, every European, or every Asian, every indigenous American, every Pacific Islander, traces their ancestry to a group of people who were once, in some sense, Africans, who made a crossing, or a series of crossings, out of the continent of human origins into an empty world. The diversity of the human species outside Africa, the thousands of languages, the variety of cultures, the physical diversity, is extraordinary. And all of it derived within the last 70,000 years from a fountain population that was small enough to carry only a fraction of the genetic variation that exists in Africa today. Africa, which is often in Western imagination the primitive end of a development spectrum, is in genetic terms the most diverse place on Earth. The oldest human populations, the widest range of variation, the deepest roots. The story of human migration out of Africa is, in some sense, the story of the world being populated by what was once a small community. And the diversity that community generated in the long journey from Africa to Tierra del Fuego to Tasmania is a testament to the extraordinary adaptive range of the human animal. We are one species. We came from one place. What we have made of that beginning, the languages, the cultures, the worldviews, is the most extraordinary proliferation of diversity in the history of life. Imagine cold you cannot imagine. Not winter morning cold, not camping in October cold, not the cold you feel stepping out of an airport in Minnesota in February. The cold of the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, approximately 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, was a different category of experience. Global average temperatures were 5 to 7 degrees Celsius below today. 5 to 7 degrees is, on average. In high latitudes, in continental interiors, the actual temperature differentials were far more extreme. Ice sheets 2 and 3 kilometers thick covered what is now London, Chicago, Stockholm, Montreal. The weight of the ice was so immense, it literally depressed the rock of the Earth's crust. Imagine the world above that ice. Endless, wind-scoured white. A sun that rises low and sets quickly. Trees absent for hundreds of miles in any direction. Temperatures that drop, in the heart of winter, to levels that kill unprotected human flesh in minutes. We were not supposed to be here. Biologically, humans are tropical animals. We have essentially no insulating fur. Our body fat is modest compared to cold-adapted mammals. Our naked skin, an adaptation for heat loss on the African savanna, radiates warmth catastrophically in a frozen environment. We cannot hibernate. We cannot migrate the way birds migrate. We have none of the physiological adaptations for cold that evolution spent millions of years engineering into bears and seals and musk oxen. And yet, across the frozen landscapes of the last glacial maximum, humans were everywhere. Not just surviving, flourishing, building structures, creating art, hunting the largest animals on Earth, maintaining trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles across tundra, raising children, caring for the elderly, singing, in all probability. How? The answer is cultural adaptation, the ability to compensate through learned and shared technology and behavior for biology's limitations. And in the Ice Age, this ability was pushed to its absolute limit and came through transformed. Begin with clothing. The bone needle, which we discussed in a previous chapter, was not a minor convenience. It was a survival technology of the first order. Before the needle, body coverings were loose, skins draped, furs wrapped, adequate in cool conditions, lethal in genuinely Arctic ones. The difference between a draped skin and a tailored, sewn. Layered garment is the difference between hypothermia and survival when temperatures drop below -30. Ice Age clothing, reconstructed from frozen specimens and from the study of surviving traditional Arctic peoples who faced comparable conditions, was a masterwork of materials engineering. The innermost layer trapped body heat next to the skin. The middle layer provided insulation. The outermost layer repelled wind and moisture. Hoods were designed to circulate warm, exhaled air across the face. Mittens connected to sleeves to prevent gaps at the wrist. Boots were constructed with multiple layers and sometimes with insulating dry grass between them, a technique still used by Arctic peoples today. Every component required different materials, different preparation techniques, different sewing methods. The full understanding of how to clothe a human being for Arctic survival was a vast body of knowledge that took generations to develop and could not be reinvented quickly if lost. Then there is shelter. In the environments of Ice Age, Europe, and Siberia, wood was often scarce or absent. The great forests that covered temperate regions today did not exist at the glacial maximum. What existed instead was the Mammoth Steppe, an enormous grassland that stretched from Western Europe across Central Asia and into the Americas, populated by vast herds of cold-adapted megafauna. And the Mammoth Steppe meant mammoths. Woolly mammoths were not just spectacular, they were a resource economy. Their meat fed families for weeks. Their hides made tents large enough to shelter a group through the worst winter. Their ivory provided raw material for tools, ornaments, and figurines, and their bones, their enormous marrow-rich bones, were fuel. In treeless tundra, fat-soaked bone burns, slowly, steadily, with a considerable heat output. Archaeological sites in Ukraine have revealed structures built from hundreds of mammoth bones arranged in complex architectural patterns, circular walls built from interlocked skulls, jawbones, and limb bones covered with hides. Some of these structures show evidence of long occupation, hearths inside, storage pits, the accumulated debris of months of habitation. People were not just camping in the Ice Age, they were building. But the most profound adaptation to the Ice Age may not be technological at all. It may be social. Consider the problem of large-scale cooperative hunting. A single mammoth, once taken, it provides an enormous caloric surplus, far more meat than any individual family can consume before it spoils. But killing a mammoth is not a solitary enterprise. Mammoths were intelligent, social animals, dangerous in ways that make a modern elephant seem manageable. Bringing one down required coordinated group action, multiple hunters, specific roles, a plan that everyone understood and could execute. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests that Ice Age hunting was organized at scales that dwarf the small foraging band. Drive sites, locations where topography funneled animals toward cliffs or prepared enclosures, show evidence of mass kills involving dozens or hundreds of animals, implying hunting parties that could only have been assembled from multiple groups working in coordination. This required something beyond kinship. It required the ability to organize cooperation among people who were not your immediate family, people from other bands, other groups, perhaps people you saw only once or twice a year at seasonal aggregation sites. It required, in other words, the social infrastructure of imagined community. Shared belief, shared identity, shared symbol. All the invisible architecture that allows humans to cooperate at scales impossible for other primates. The Ice Age did not just challenge human bodies. It challenged human societies to become more complex, more organized, more capable of coordinated action at large scales, and they rose to that challenge. There is something else the Ice Age gave us that is harder to quantify, but perhaps equally important: the experience of radical change. Ice Ages are not static. They pulse, they advance and retreat. They transform landscapes over lifetimes. A person born in a warming period might die in a cooling one. A group's entire territory, the landscape that defined their identity, their resource base, their spiritual world, could become uninhabitable over the course of 2 or 3 generations. This is something no previous species with human-level cognition had ever experienced. Climate change on a timescale that fit within cultural memory. The elders had seen things the young had not. Stories about warmer times, about animals that were gone, about places that were now under ice, were not myths. They were living knowledge about a changing world. This temporal awareness, the knowledge that the world could change, that the present was not permanent, that the past was different and the future might be too, may have been one of the Ice Age's most profound cognitive gifts. It cultivated a kind of anticipatory thinking, a long-range planning orientation that would become crucial to survival as conditions shifted. And then, around 19,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat. The retreat was, in geological terms, rapid. Within a few thousand years, ice sheets that had covered continents were gone. Sea levels rose as the frozen water returned to the ocean. Coastlines that had been settled for generations were inundated. The mammoth steppe, that great engine of megafaunal abundance, transformed into taiga and tundra and parkland, environments that could not support the enormous herds that had sustained Ice Age hunters, and the megafauna died. The causes of the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions are still debated, but the pattern is chillingly consistent. Wherever humans arrived, the largest animals soon disappeared. In Australia, the giant marsupials were gone within a few thousand years of human arrival. In the Americas, mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, animals that had survived dozens of Ice Age cycles over millions of years, were gone within a millennium of the first American humans. Animals that had never encountered human hunters had no instinctive fear of us. They did not run. They did not charge. They stood and watched as the strange bipedal creatures with their throwing sticks and coordinated tactics surrounded them. We were the most efficient predator the world had ever produced, and we hunted them to extinction. This is part of our inheritance too, not just the art and the needles and the social intelligence, the destruction, the capacity to transform ecosystems in ways that cannot be reversed, to love the world and simultaneously consume it. That tension is not modern. It is as old as we are. There is one more aspect of Ice Age life that deserves attention: the management of knowledge across generations in conditions of extreme environmental volatility. In stable environments, traditional ecological knowledge can be transmitted with relative confidence that what was true last generation will be true this generation. The waterhole, is still where your grandmother said it was. The herd still follows the same migration route. Ice Age environments were not stable. The climate shifted. The animal populations changed. The landscape transformed. What had been true for your grandmother might not be true for your granddaughter. This created a specific cognitive and cultural challenge. How do you transmit knowledge that might need to be modified? How do you teach accumulated wisdom while also preserving the flexibility to revise it? The answer, we think, involved a sophisticated relationship between tradition and innovation that is actually quite recognizable from modern science. You transmit the core methods, the principles of observation, the habits of attention, the practices of verification, while acknowledging that specific findings are provisional. Ice Age peoples who did this well survived. Those who held too rigidly to the specific knowledge of their grandparents, who insisted that the mammoth must still be in the valley where the grandparents hunted them, even as the evidence showed otherwise, did not survive or survived less well. This adaptive epistemology, holding knowledge as authoritative but revisable, transmitting method alongside content, may be one of the deepest cognitive inheritances of the Ice Age. It is, recognizably, the same attitude that characterizes good scientific practice. The Ice Age did not just give us the technical capacity to survive cold, it gave us a relationship with knowledge itself that prizes both tradition and revision, both respect for accumulated wisdom and willingness to update it in the face of new evidence. That is a gift, even if we have often forgotten that we received it. Around 12,000 years ago, something happened that changed the entire trajectory of human life on Earth. Something that, in retrospect, looks so consequential it is almost impossible to examine without a kind of vertigo. A group of people, probably somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from the Levant through what is now Turkey and down through Mesopotamia, began doing something new. They started planting seeds intentionally. They returned to the same patch of ground, season after season. They protected certain plants and removed others. They selected the biggest seeds for replanting. They began slowly and probably without conscious awareness of what they were doing to domesticate the wild ancestors of wheat and barley and lentils. This is the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from foraging to farming, at the beginning of civilization as we know it. And here is the dark secret at its center that no history class ever teaches clearly. It was a catastrophe for the humans who experienced it, not in the long run. In the long run, agriculture produced everything we associate with civilization: cities, writing, science, medicine, art of extraordinary complexity, the ability to sustain billions of people on a finite planet. But in the immediate term, the first farmers were, by almost every measurable metric, worse off than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. The bones do not lie. Bioarchaeologists studying the skeletal remains from early agricultural sites across the world have found a consistent signature. Compared to the hunter-gatherers who preceded them in the same regions, early farmers were shorter, often by several inches. Their bones show more signs of nutritional deficiency, dental enamel hypoplasia, evidence of childhood growth disruption, porotic hyperostosis, indicating iron deficiency anemia. Their teeth were eroded by the carbohydrates that now dominated their diets in ways hunter-gatherer teeth were not. Their joints show more evidence of repetitive strain. They also got sick more often, living in close proximity to domesticated animals, sleeping near them, eating their meat, handling their waste, created conditions for the transmission of zoonotic diseases, measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis. These are not ancient curses. They are agricultural diseases, products of the dense, multi-species settlements that farming made possible. Hunter-gatherers, mobile and dispersed, were largely immune to the epidemic dynamics that would periodically devastate settled populations. So why? If farming was worse health, worse diet, more work, more disease, why did it happen? Why did any group of people abandon a system that had sustained the species for 290,000 years in favor of something that so clearly diminished their physical well-being? Several answers have been proposed, and the truth is probably some combination of them all. The first answer is coercion by circumstance. The end of the last ice age transformed ecosystems around the world in ways that disrupted the foraging life. Megafauna extinctions removed the rich, reliable protein sources that had sustained ice age hunters. Climate shifts changed plant communities, reducing the abundance of the wild grasses and tubers that gatherers depended on. And simultaneously, human populations had grown during the relatively stable conditions of the late Paleolithic. More people, fewer wild resources. In this view, farming was not a choice. It was a survival strategy adopted when the alternative became untenable. Not progress, desperation. The second answer involves social competition and the logic of surplus. In most traditional societies, prestige is earned by demonstrating generosity, by hosting feasts, by giving gifts, by providing food that proves your power to provide. A skilled forager can sustain a group, but a farmer can produce surplus, more food per unit of land than foraging allows, at the cost of much greater labor. Surplus is the currency of power. With surplus, you can host bigger feasts. You can feed more followers. You can build things. You can employ specialists who do not produce their own food, but produce other valuable things: pottery, metalwork, ritual, warfare. In this view, agriculture was driven not by hunger, but by ambition. The first farmers were not starving foragers who discovered a better way to eat. They were social competitors who discovered a new way to translate labor into status. The third answer involves a ratchet effect. Once farming begins, even accidentally, even as a small supplement to foraging, it tends to lock in. Here is why. Farming can support more people per unit of land than foraging. More people means a bigger group. A bigger group is, in most circumstances, a more competitive group. The farming group grows. The foraging group, unable to expand beyond the carrying capacity of wild resources, stays the same size or shrinks. Over generations, the farmers are simply more numerous, and population has momentum. Once a group has grown to a size that only agriculture can support, abandoning agriculture is not an option. You cannot feed the people you have on wild resources that were already stretched before the population grew. The ratchet turns one way only. At a site called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating to approximately 11,600 years ago and predating any known agricultural settlement, archaeologists have found something that throws all these theories into productive confusion. Massive stone circles, up to 30 meters in diameter, decorated with extraordinary bas-relief carvings of animals, built by people who appear to have been still primarily hunter-gatherers. Building these structures required enormous coordinated labor. Feeding and housing the laborers required food surplus, but the people doing it were not, so far as we can tell, yet farmers in the full sense. They appear to have been creating the surplus through intensive wild plant harvesting and management, which is, if you squint at it just right, farming in its earliest, most tentative form. Perhaps the question is backwards. Perhaps it was not that people settled down and then built temples. Perhaps it was that they wanted to build temples, needed to gather, needed to feast, needed to meet and perform the social rituals that bound communities together. And that need drove them to produce the surplus that eventually became full agriculture. Perhaps civilization did not produce religion. Perhaps religion produced civilization. Whatever the cause, the consequences were transformative in ways that echo through every dimension of life today. Sedentism, the shift to permanent settlement, made accumulation possible for the first time. Mobile foragers could not own more than they could carry. Settled farmers could build storage, construct permanent structures, accumulate wealth. And accumulated wealth meant, for the first time in human history, that some people could have significantly more than others. Hierarchy emerged not as a natural expression of human nature, but as a structural consequence of agriculture. When there is surplus, someone controls the surplus. When land is fixed, someone owns the land. When ownership is inheritable, children of the powerful inherit power. The rough egalitarianism of the foraging band, maintained through constant vigilance and mutual enforcement, could not survive the arrival of stored grain and permanent settlement. The Great Reversal was underway. In exchange for physical health, equality, autonomy, and the intimate community of the foraging band, the first farmers received something that would eventually produce everything we call civilization. The ability to sustain dense populations, to accumulate resources across generations, to build institutions, to create the surplus that funds specialization, that funds philosophy and science and art at scale. It is not clear that the deal was worth it. For the individuals who lived through the transition, it almost certainly was not. For the species as a whole, looking across 10,000 years of building on the agricultural foundation, the answer is genuinely ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that we are living with the consequences right now. The obesity epidemic, the diabetes epidemic, the anxiety epidemic, these are not mysteries. We have dietary systems built on the crops that first farmers domesticated under pressure, optimized over 10,000 years for caloric density rather than nutritional completeness, now consumed by bodies that spent the previous 290,000 years being fed something very different. We have nervous systems shaped by the intimate social demands of the foraging band, now operating in the anonymous mass societies that agriculture made possible. Societies our social architecture was not designed to handle. we have, in the most literal sense, bodies and minds built for one world, living in a world that agriculture constructed over the last 12,000 years. The agricultural revolution was not a mistake. It was not a trap in the sense of being deliberately set or avoidable. It was the product of pressures and incentives and contingencies that played out across countless generations without anyone grasping the full picture. But it changed what it means to be human. And it changed us in ways we are still, 12,000 years later, working out how to live with. There is a specific moment I want to give you because the transition to agriculture is too large to feel unless it has a human face. Imagine a woman living approximately 12,500 years ago in the region we now call the Levant, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, roughly modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. She is a member of the Natufian culture, which is, in a sense, the pivot point of human history. She is not quite a farmer. She is not quite a hunter-gatherer. She is something in between, what archaeologists call a complex forager. Her people return to the same locations year after year, exploiting the dense stands of wild wheat and barley that grow in the river valleys. They have semi-permanent settlements. They have cemeteries. They have a rich material culture, including groundstone tools for processing grain. Her life requires more labor than her fully nomadic ancestors. The grain must be harvested in a narrow window when it is ripe, but before it shatters and scatters, it must be processed, ground, perhaps soaked, perhaps parched, before it can be eaten in quantity. It must be stored. The storage must be protected. But her people are not yet fully sedentary. When conditions are bad, drought, disease, resource depletion, they can still move. The option is still available. The knowledge of the mobile life is still within living memory. Her granddaughter will not have that option. By the time her granddaughter is born, the population in the valley will have grown, as populations always do when food becomes more reliable and abundant. The storage pits will have expanded. The settlements will have become more permanent. The knowledge of how to live without the fixed location will have begun to fade. The granddaughter will know only the settled life, and the settled life will require more work, not less. More grain, more processing, more storage, more protection, more people to feed, more mouths that depend on the harvest not failing. When the harvest fails, and it will eventually, because monocultures are fragile in ways that diverse wild landscapes are not, there will be no option to disperse and forage. There are too many people. There is no dispersing 200 people with no wild food knowledge into a landscape that cannot support them. The daughter of the granddaughter will be shorter than her great-grandmother was. Her bones will show the strain of repetitive agricultural labor. Her teeth will bear the marks of a diet that is calorically dense but nutritionally narrow. She will live in a world of increasing inequality as the people who control the stored grain begin to differentiate from those who do not. She will not remember the free life. She will not remember the 30-hour work week, the intimate band, the daily movement through a known and beloved landscape. She will remember only what her world offers, the permanence, the surplus, the slowly building complexity of settlement life. And from that world, eventually, will come everything else. The cities and the writing, and the science, and the medicine, and the art. The 12,000-year project of civilization. Built on her shortened bones and her narrow diet and the freedom she never knew she had lost. You are 300,000 years old. Not you personally, not this body, not this particular configuration of memories and preferences and fears, but you, the you that runs deeper than any of that, the neural architecture that generates your consciousness, the emotional systems that drive your behavior, the social instincts that shape every relationship you have ever had or will have. That you, the deep you, the operational you, was forged across 300,000 years of a world that no longer exists. Let me tell you what that means in practical terms, not in the abstract language of evolutionary theory, but in the specific, daily texture of modern life. Why do you fear the dark? Not the dark of a power outage in a modern building. That is inconvenience, not fear. The real thing, the irrational, precognitive spike of anxiety that comes when you are somewhere genuinely dark and something moves. The racing heart that precedes any conscious thought. The scanning alertness that your higher brain knows is inappropriate but cannot override. You fear the dark because for 300,000 years, darkness killed people. Not metaphorically, literally. The African night was populated by leopards and lions, by hyenas that hunted in packs, by nocturnal predators that had the enormous advantage of specialized night vision against prey, us who had none. The individuals who responded to darkness with relaxed indifference were, over enough generations, selected out of the gene pool. The ones who tensed, who scanned, who woke at the slightest unfamiliar sound, they survived. Their vigilance is your anxiety. Why do you crave stories told around fires? Because for 300,000 years, the firelit circle was the center of human social life. It was where knowledge was shared, where the day's events were processed into narrative, where the dead were remembered and the future was planned. It was the original community, the original belonging. Every time you find yourself pulled toward a campfire, drawn into the particular intimacy of a conversation that stretches late under stars, feeling something open in your chest that the bright fluorescence of ordinary life keeps closed, you are experiencing a memory older than language. Why do you feel the specific loneliness of modern life even when you are technically surrounded by people? Because you evolved for a group of 30 to 50 people who knew you completely, who had known you since birth, whose histories were intertwined with yours, whose survival depended on your cooperation, and whose cooperation you depended on in turn. Every member of your community knew your name, your family, your strengths and failings. You were never anonymous. You were never alone in the modern sense of being socially invisible. Now, you live in cities of millions. You interact daily with people who do not know your name, will never know your history, have no particular investment in your survival. Your phone delivers the physiological feedback of social connection, notifications, likes, messages, without the actual social connection that those signals evolved to represent. You are lonely in the way a caged animal is lonely, not because the cage is cruel, But because the cage is the wrong environment for the creature that lives in it, why does meaningful work feel so different from most of the work modern economies actually offer? Because your ancestors worked in ways that produced immediate, visible, directly experienced results. You hunted, the animal was dead, the group ate. You gathered, the roots were in the basket. The children would not go hungry. The feedback loop between effort and outcome was direct and concrete. The meaning of the work was self-evident. Modern labor is often abstracted beyond recognition. You produce inputs to a process that produces inputs to another process that eventually, somewhere downstream, produces something that possibly benefits someone. The chain of causation between your specific effort and any concrete human good is so long and so opaque that most people cannot trace it at all. We call this alienation, a word Karl Marx invented. But its roots are older than any economic system. They go back to the mismatch between what human motivation evolved to need and what modern economies actually provide. Why do you feel something specific and different when you are in nature? Genuinely in it, not near it, but in it. Because nature was not merely our environment, it was us. For 300,000 years, the boundary between human and natural was not a boundary at all. We were embedded in ecosystems we understood at an intimate level that modern people can barely imagine. We knew every plant, every animal, every seasonal rhythm of the territory we inhabited. The natural world was not a backdrop to human life. It was the medium in which human life occurred. When you step into a forest and feel something shift in your nervous system, a slowing, a quieting, a sense of being more fully present than you usually are, that is not aesthetic preference. That is your ancient, properly calibrated nervous system recognizing, at some level below cognition, that it is finally in an environment it was built for. The research is unequivocal. Exposure to natural environments reduces cortisol, reduces blood pressure, reduces anxiety, improves immune function, improves cognitive performance. This is not mysticism. This is evolutionary medicine. We are healthier in nature because we evolved in nature. The modern built environment, for all its comforts and conveniences, it is a kind of permanent mild stress, a mismatch between organism and habitat that runs 24 hours a day. Now here is where I want to land, because this cannot just be a diagnosis. A diagnosis without a direction is just productive despair. You cannot go back. The world of the foraging band is gone. The landscapes that sustained it have been transformed beyond recognition. The knowledge required to live in it is largely lost. And even if none of that were true, even if you could go back, you would not want to, not permanently. You would miss antibiotics. You would miss the ability to communicate with someone on the other side of the planet. You would miss the accumulated art and science and philosophy of 10,000 years of civilization. But understanding where you came from is not about going back. It is about going forward with more accuracy. When you understand that your need for close, intimate, genuine community is not a weakness or an immaturity to be outgrown, it is a biological imperative, as real as your need for food and water. You can stop treating it as optional. You can stop accepting the simulation of community that social media provides and start building the real thing, even in modern conditions, even in a city, even in a world not designed for it. When you understand that your children's resistance to being still, being quiet, following rules, memorizing information delivered by an authority figure in a room with no natural light, when you understand that this resistance is not dysfunction, but a perfectly appropriate response from a brain that evolved to learn through play and exploration and natural environment, you can stop pathologizing it and start working with it. When you understand that your recurring sense that something is missing, despite having everything, the good job, the comfortable apartment, the filled social calendar, is not ingratitude, not depression, not a failure of perspective, but an accurate perception of genuine absence, you can start trying to address the actual deficit rather than the symptoms. The ancestors are not gone. They are in you. In the quickened heartbeat when genuine darkness falls. In the involuntary ease that comes when you sit with people you love around a fire. In the satisfaction of work done with your hands, whose result you can see and touch. In the particular aliveness you feel when moving through wild landscape under open sky. These are not nostalgia. They are not romantic projections. They are signals, messages from 300,000 years of ancestral experience encoded in the most basic operations of your nervous system. The question is whether you are listening. We stand now at a moment in human history without precedent. The challenges we face, climate disruption, mass extinction, the concentration of power in systems too complex for any individual to fully comprehend, are new in their specifics. But the underlying dynamic is ancient. It is the same dynamic that sent a small group of humans across a narrow strait of water 70,000 years ago. The same dynamic that drove people deep into frozen caves to record their visions on stone. The same dynamic that brought communities together again and again to do things that could not be done alone. The response to existential challenge for our species has always been the same. It is not individual brilliance. It is not technological salvation from above. It is the deepest, most ancient, most reliable thing we have ever produced. Cooperation, creativity, the willingness to look clearly at a hard situation and work together to survive it. We did not come down from the trees to sit in traffic and scroll feeds and feel, quietly, that something essential has been lost. We came down from the trees to do something extraordinary, to fill the world with consciousness, to make the invisible visible, to sing in the dark and find, in the singing, that we are not alone. That capacity is not diminished. It is not archaic. It did not evolve away when we built our first city. It is still here. You are still here. 300,000 years of survival, of creativity, of love against the dark. All of it accumulated in the single fact of your existence. You are the last page of an enormous book, but you are also the first page of whatever comes next. The fire is waiting. The stars overhead are the same stars your ancestors navigated by, crossed oceans by, painted on cave walls by. The ancestors walked into the dark 1,000 times. They walked out the other side. So can you. So can we. The story is not over. It never was. I want to close with something that is less analysis and more invitation. We live in a moment of profound historical self-consciousness. We know more about our past, the deep past, the prehistoric past, than any generation before us. The tools of genetic analysis, of isotope dating, of computational modeling of ancient climates and populations have given us access to a past that was completely invisible to our great-grandparents. This is a gift. And like all gifts, it comes with responsibility. The responsibility is not to romanticize the past, not to construct a fictional golden age of contented savages and project our own discontents onto its imagined perfection. The hunter-gatherer life was not paradise. It was hard in specific, physical, immediate ways that most of us would find genuinely terrible. The responsibility is to be honest about what has been lost, not to mourn it, but to understand it. Because what has been lost was not lost accidentally. It was traded. It was exchanged for other things: medicine, coordination at scale, the ability to sustain 8 billion people on a finite planet. These are not nothing. They are extraordinary. But the terms of the trade were not transparent. The people who made the trade did not know they were making it. They were responding to immediate pressures, making locally rational decisions, with no ability to see the 10,000-year consequences. We can see them now, and that changes our responsibility. We can now design our lives, our communities, our institutions, with some awareness of what human beings actually need. Not just what our current economic arrangements happen to provide. We can ask, what does the science of deep prehistory tell us about the conditions under which humans flourish? And then ask, how much of that can we build into modern life? More time in genuine community. More work whose purpose is visible and meaningful. More contact with natural environments. More of the intimate, face-to-face, name-knowing relationships that the foraging band guaranteed and modern society often fails to provide. None of this requires abandoning the gifts of civilization. It requires adding back the things we did not notice we were giving up. The ancestors are not a blueprint. They are a mirror. Look at them honestly, and you see reflected back a version of yourself stripped of everything constructed. Just the animal with its needs and its gifts, and its stubborn insistence on meaning in the face of the dark. That animal is still there. Take care of it. The story of the hidden 95% is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about what you carry in your body and your nervous system and your oldest, most inarticulate longings. You did not choose to carry it, but you do. And knowing you carry it, knowing what it is, where it came from, what it was shaped to do, is perhaps the beginning of using it well. That is enough. That is, perhaps, everything. Go find your fire.